Here is our interview with George Howard. This subject is something that Michael Parker, my producer, has dug into. In fact, he's interviewed Graham Hancock before. And I saw that Hancock had a big thing on Rogan. I didn't get to see that. But I'm going to make sure I'm pronouncing it correctly. The younger Dryas?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Dryas impact. As I looked into it, I think the angle that I'm most interested in is this just idea in general of cosmic impacts. And it being your position that we have underestimated the number of these. And therefore, I guess, underestimated the likelihood of another one hitting. So walk me through what you see as the disagreement right now in the scientific community about the number of times we've had a cosmic impact.
No, that's an excellent question. And we do believe they've been far more frequent in the past. And there are hints all over mythology and geology and whatnot that there are more impacts out there than we've been willing to acknowledge. And the reason for that is that most of our impact estimates are done from asteroids, right? And they dismiss comets because comets are fairly rare. And
what's the difference between an asteroid and a comet?
Yeah, that's become increasingly fuzzy through the years. It's kind of a range, but at the either end of the range, a comet's made of more of a frozen material and frozen gases interspersed with rocky type stuff, as far as we know. We haven't been able to investigate them as closely as we should. And then they're sublimating, they call it, as they come into a solar orbit and settle in. As they get closer to the sun, they burn off and can eventually become much more asteroid-like. So some asteroids were never comets, but many asteroids were at one time, and all comets can become an asteroid over time as they burn off and leave away the gaseous material and the frozen stuff. So they used to refer to them as dirty snowballs, but they're probably a lot dirtier than we appreciate. Mm-hmm. But comets also fragment when they're going around the sun, and when they come in, particularly when they're having a first visit. And we didn't appreciate that years ago. And most of the impact estimates are done, in fact, all of the impact estimates by NASA are done based off the idea that there's a single point in space that is a comet, right? They don't account for the fact that when the comet is fragmenting, which turns out to be very, very common, we've seen it several times just in our lifetimes, that fragmentation takes the form of more like a shotgun spray, right? So they're doing the impact estimates off of one point in space and don't appreciate the fact that there can be a spray of material left over from the comet, some of it hard and dense, that can result in impacts, literally over a series of days. And we see the same phenomena in meteor showers, right? Those are disintegrated comets.
Are comets generally much bigger than asteroids?
Yeah, there's one coming at us now that I think would be larger than most any asteroid. They call it BB. It's got a hard to pronounce name, but I think it's 100 kilometers wide. It's not coming at us, but it's coming into the solar system for its first trip.
And what's the origin of asteroids and comets? How did they start cruising around the universe to begin with?
Yeah, at some point, either in our own solar system, in the terms of the asteroids, we've got an asteroid belt, in the outer solar system that is probably the result of some type of impact between two large bodies within our own solar system over time. In other words, something happened here and left a bunch of rocks circling around, right? Then comets have been ejected at some point from other bodies or other bodies colliding out in interstellar space, right? And come in both that way and from what they call the Oort cloud, which is hundreds of times the Earth-Sun distance, far, far out in space. There's a large ring of basically snowballs, interspersed with rocky material, if you will, within them. And that becomes destabilized at times, and it has a natural instability to it. And the Oort cloud can feed comets kind of randomly into the solar system. And
so bottom line, we got things inside the solar system and outside the solar system to be concerned about.
That's exactly right. And they can come up at any time.
Yeah. So the one that everybody seems to talk most about is whatever the asteroid or comet, you tell me, that impacted the Earth that led to the extinction of the dinosaurs. That's the one that everybody seems to be aware of. And
that's right.
I assume is Is that commonly accepted?
It is commonly accepted, and that gives us a lot of hope with the Comet research team, which we call our research group, that we're going through kind of the same paradigm shift that occurred when people accepted the dinosaur impact in the 80s and early 90s. It's very, very almost spookily similar scientific debate, which is very, very heated, right? Unfortunately, we don't have two Nobel Prize winner leading our research team as they did with Alvarez Sr. at the time. So they had a Nobel winner was actually leading that effort. So that brought a lot more attention to it. And it was also easier for people to accept that something so cataclysmic could have happened in the distant past because it separated us. And there's long been a break between two paradigms of geology, between catastrophism and uniformitarianism, which is kind of believing that everything that we see, all earth changes are occurring today and are just enhanced erosion, right? Enhanced wind features, et cetera, that have occurred over great amounts of time and they've left the earth that we see today. Well, 200 years ago, and many people today, and including our group, believe that that's absolutely true, that most of the features we see are caused by geological processes underway today, but it's also interrupted at time with catastrophic changes, sudden changes. And our event would have happened only 12,880 or so years ago, probably in June. I can tell you how we got to that. And the dinosaur impact was 65 million years ago. So that's 3,500 times more distant in time. So it's good to keep that timeline in mind. It's almost like if you were at the dinosaur comet impact and me here on the East Coast in Raleigh was at the Younger Dryas event, or I'm at the current time, the Younger Dryas event would only be about a mile from me, right? Mm-hmm. And the dinosaur event would have been 3,500 miles. It's a lot easier to swallow.
So that one's commonly accepted. How many others are, major impacts to the earth are commonly accepted in science?
Hundreds, or I think about 175 major impacts, but all of them date to, generally more than 1 million years old. Although there's certainly some exceptions. Meteor Crater in Arizona is, I think it's estimated to be about 55,000 years old. So that would have been seen by humans. The big, perfectly shaped bowl crater outside of Flagstaff would have been witnessed by humans. But it's not.
Sorry, that one is how old?
55,000 years.
Okay. Yeah. And how far back are we dating humans at this point?
300,000 years, I believe now. They just had some finds in Morocco that put us back about that far. And it used to be considered more like 150, 200. So we've witnessed some impacts. Yeah.
So this one 55,000 years ago, you're saying that one is commonly accepted.
Yeah, that's right.
And did that have it, other than creating a big crater on the earth, what else did that one do they believe?
Yeah, it would have had just local and regional effects. It wouldn't have changed the global or hemispheric climate like the Younger Dryas event did.
Okay. So now I can see why, this is so controversial, because we're talking about it being accepted. What I forgot what you said, 60 million years ago for the dinosaurs versus something happening way more recent and having what did you call about the climate impact?
And it would have caused what's well accepted. Is kind of interesting that there's a body of science that's been developing over the last 40 or 50 years about the Younger Dryas event as a climate change in itself, and that's well accepted.
Yeah, and what are the two theories on that Younger Dryas event? We're talking about 12,000 BC ballpark, right?
Yeah.
Or you might have it even more specific, but your guys, your team is calling it a cosmic impact. And what does the other side say it was?
Yeah, they believe for reasons undescribed, because they will say it's a mystery, right? But that in essence, that there was a large influx of fresh water off the Canadian ice sheet that broke up in some fashion and allowed the large glacial lake that was sitting on top of the ice sheet. I guess you wouldn't call it glacial, but the ice sheet lake, Lake Agassiz, many times the size of the Great Lakes, to flow into the North Atlantic and Arctic Sea. And that was particularly damaging to climate in the North Atlantic because it shut down the Gulf Stream. That's all well accepted. The question is, what initiated that flow? They consider that a mystery. We offered up evidence that there was an impact into the ice sheet and other places in the Northern Hemisphere, perhaps in the Southern Hemisphere as well. In fact, we've got a paper that defines a Southern Hemispheric impact, so shouldn't say perhaps, but that we were traumatized, over a period of time that may have repeated at the same time of year before and after for some period of years. Maybe it went on for 100 years, that we kept encountering a meteor shower that was particularly traumatic to Earth. But during that 12,880 plus or minus time, we had a very, very bad long weekend where we could have had objects that would have been crater producing, but also hundreds of objects that would have really acted like nuclear bombs without the radiation. All of the effects of nuclear bombs, from the high heat to the pressure waves, et cetera, can occur when you have just a 50 to 100 meter object enter the atmosphere and then explode. Because remember, these things are coming in at kind of solar system speeds. Relative speeds between bodies in the solar system could be much higher than anything we can experience on Earth. So this stuff would come in at 70 or 80,000 miles an hour. So 100 times the speed of a rifle bullet. And when something like that comes in and hits the atmosphere, it's almost like somebody hitting the water when they jump off a bridge. They don't hit the bottom of the river, right? They kind of explode in the water, if you will. Sorry to be graphic there, but you hit something more dense, and that causes a great release of kinetic energy. And that would result in explosions all over the Earth and trauma to species, including the human species.
So, yeah, I wanted to get to that next. Regardless of what caused this Younger Dryas period, there's agreement that it took place. Is there agreement as to what the effects of the Younger Dryas period was? Do both sides pretty much agree on that?
That's right. And the really the two most mysterious were the disappearance of 90% of the megafauna in North America. And megafauna are large mammals over 40 kilograms, right? So 250 species of animals went extinct around that time or relatively shortly thereafter. They all crashed in population at that time. And some of them seem to have blinked out more or less precisely at that time.
And what's one that we would know most about?
Well, there were two species of mammoth, the woolly mammoth and the Columbian mammoth. I've got a 11-foot long mammoth tusk over here on the wall that has been part of the debate. The giant ground sloth, which would have been a sloth that was, 15, 20 feet high. Beavers the size of Suburbans. Gigantic armadillos. Now remember, all of this stuff, Jim, was only 13,000 years ago. Humans walked the earth. Modern Homo sapiens in North America, in the places we live today, walked around with Africa savanna on steroids. A tremendously dangerous place where these would have had to been very, very crafty, skilled people just to survive in the presence of these things. But again, back kind of the African savanna comparison, you had the American lion, the American cheetah, the American jaguar. You had horses in North America at the time. There was a larger version of our current bison called Bison antiquus. And all of this begins or does go extinct right at the time of the Younger Dryas.
And as you said, there's broad agreement on that.
That's right. And it's also considered, just like the climate crash, to be a mystery. But mysteries don't endure forever. And it seems like science has, accepted the fact that this is a mystery and perhaps we won't ever solve it. When in 2007, we offered evidence that that impacts were the cause.
And what was the impact on humans?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jim. And it's got a interesting and kind of mysterious answer. The original culture, Paleo-Indian culture, to inhabit North America, that was considered widespread and easily identified through their kind of unique spear point. I usually have one with me, but called the Clovis Point. And Clovis points are found from Seattle to Miami to Tierra del Fuego. So there was one common culture of Indians that produced those points. And for many, many years, most of the 20th century, that was considered the very first Indian culture. And you might have heard the idea that they came over on the Bering Land Bridge, from Asia, and very quickly populated North and South America. Well, that's very true. That sense has been very well challenged, and people are falling off the idea that they were the very first people in North and South America, right? The Clovis culture was certainly the one that's easily identified through their lithics, through their stone tools. But we also find older tools now, sometimes reaching back 20 and 30,000 years. And that in itself was a big scientific debate. But there's really no question that there weren't a whole lot of those people until the Clovis people came along. But Jim, then the Clovis people disappear right at the time of the impact. And the time of the impact is defined by what we call the black mat. I'd be happy to describe that to you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, the black mat had actually been identified for, decades at archaeological sites and paleontological sites where they were, say, digging to find the Clovis people and to find the earliest North American Indians, right? Or to find the bones and remains of the extinct megafauna. And those researchers noted at the time that they generally found them after they encountered a thin layer of distinctly darker soil, oftentimes underlaid by soil for several more meters that did not resemble the soil above it. So you'll have a certain character of the soil, then you'll have a black mat, and then up until modern times in the soil column, getting younger and younger as you move up the soil, all of that oftentimes will change color and character too. So they would dig down onto the black mat, and only below the black mat, and never ever once above, have they found the Clovis tools or most of the megafauna bones, particularly mammoth and whatnot.
And how are you talking about digging?
Depends on where you are, but generally only 2 or 3 meters. This isn't a long time ago from a soil sedimentation standpoint. But that black mat, and particularly that which is under it, which is where we find the cosmic materials that provide the evidence for the impact, would have been continent-wide. But it can only be seen now digging down in places that have not eroded since, right? So most of our landscape, one way or another, has been reorganized and eroded and whatnot, and probably removed that evidence. But in a number of places, particularly those where they've chosen to do research, they know that the soil has continued to accumulate, right? And if you go back through that regularly accumulating soil, including in like caves where the sediment washes into the cave and you'll get a very, very regular pulse of sediment, and you go back and look at that, you have the black mat. And then below the black mat is the breath of hell, right? That's where we find our very best evidence that there was an impact. And that's using the very same tools, the same metrics, and the same evidence that they used to prove the comet dinosaur impact. You might remember in those studies that they call it the KT boundary, the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary, and you can see it in rock, right? So that was sediment at one time, 65 million years ago. It's now formed into rock, but you actually find a discolored, different colored band there. Sometimes maybe it's a black band, just like the black mat. And that what the Alvarez team started doing in 1980, their insight was, what is the geochemistry of that band of rock versus that below it and that above it? Is there anything special about that? And what they discovered was, ground shaking. It's totally accepted by science now, or 99%. There's still a few holdouts. That because there was it was so highly enriched with the rare earth metal iridium, which is much more common in solar materials than it is the Earth's crust, that indicated that there was some kind of input into the sediment at the time, which is now formed into rock. So you find it enriched in that iridium, and you know that something came from above at that time, that we had some interaction with the outside, that it wasn't a closed system. So you also find a number of actual physical things. Now, these are very, very small, and you have to use transmission electron microscopes, and it's detailed forensic tools are needed. But when the hack that we used, if you will, was to go to well-dated archaeological sites, particularly those where the Clovis people were noted, where you got to the black mat, and below that you'd find the Clovis tools, and you test that soil and you find a whole variety of materials that would not be there unless there was an incredible conflagration, high heat, high pressure impact.
And this, excuse me, and this was debated on the Joe Rogan show, right?
Yeah, that's right. And Rogan's been a tremendous booster to, to our hypothesis. Yeah.
Yeah. So people can go look that up. It's Graham Hancock on the Rogan show to, I guess, to see that debate. And I guess you would say that Hancock won the debate.
Hancock did win the debate. They've been on, him and Randall Carlson have done probably up to 20 shows now, if you take both of their appearances, separate and together. And those have been some of the most popular Rogan episodes. But Joe did a great thing. I don't think he's done it a lot. Maybe he'll do it more in the future, seeing how much grief he's taking these days. But he did have a debate. And he had the pro and con sides. And he had one of the researchers on our team and Graham Hancock on one side and Randall Carlson. So that was 3. And then on the other side, he had a researcher named Mark DeFont and Michael Shermer, who you might have come across, Shermer, who's kind of a professional skeptic and has his own podcast. And they took the skeptical view. And both of them had been longtime skeptics of our hypothesis. So they debated on Rogan, Jim, and it was a hell of a debate. Subsequently, both DeFont and Shermer came around and said on Twitter that they had changed their mind, that some of our additional evidence had changed their mind. And that hasn't made it on Rogan yet, but it's one of the most exciting things that have happened to us of that type, where you had your dug-in critics who spent hours debating their case. And how often do you see that these days? You've really got to appreciate their intellectual integrity.
Yeah. A lot of people don't like to change opinions today. All right, let's tick through a few things I want to make sure that I just asked you quick questions on. Going back to the dinosaurs, what survived that comment? What species survived?
Well, fortunately, since we're here, kind of a small rodent, very early mammals, right? Those things that could burrow and live beneath the ground.
So what
reptiles survived?
When you say rodent, are you talking about rats?
Yeah. Maybe more like a mole.
So moles. What you're saying is the moles we see today were around when the dinosaurs were here, is what you're saying?
Yeah, not the moles we see today, but kind of a species much like that.
Okay.
Small rodent-like creatures, and then they supposedly evolved into us. And you had a great show on that last week.
Yeah. Well, we can get into that for a minute if we have time. And you said some reptiles.
Yeah, that's right. The alligators and crocodiles and that kind of stuff are essentially dinosaurs that made it. Mm-hmm. Right.
So the little lizards in our backyards are dinosaurs essentially.
Yeah, that's right. And so are the birds, right? That there's an increasing connection between birds having been in one way or another descended from the same class of creatures that we call dinosaurs. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And all of that obviously makes sense as far as it being a common, explaining why birds would survive. Yeah. As opposed to most other things.
Yeah. And just like the Younger Dryas event, it seemed to preferentially take out the larger creatures. Right? Because they would have required more biomass. They would have lost their food source for decades, et cetera. And it seems like those that can struggle through have to be kind of smaller in stature. Mm-hmm. Right?
Okay. And then ticking through some big events from the past and whether you think it's comet related or not, et cetera. So one is the biblical flood, which we don't know if that's historical or not. So give us your just quick take on the Noah's Ark flood. Is that historical or not? And if so, what was it called?
A lot of people very appropriately speculate that the Younger Dryas event would have been the origin of those flood stories. But
now, Jim, according to the Bible, they have it pegged around 2500 BC for the flood.
Yeah.
Right? Whereas you're talking about the Dryas event being 12,000 BC, right?
That's right, but I don't subscribe to the Younger Dryas event, which is my subject, being the source of the biblical flood. I think it was a subsequent impact, roughly 6,000 BC or 8,000 years ago.
Okay, so and again, I'm just pulling this stuff off of Wikipedia. Sure. So as far as what biblical scholars apparently put the Noah's flood around 2,500 BC, but who knows, right?
Yeah, that's right. Who knows? But we've got an interesting intersection. Our same research team, and I did myself, we went over to Jordan in 2014 and 2015, and we published a paper last year, which is now arguably the most read scientific publication on Earth right now, and it'll die away at some point. But we published a paper that said in 1700 BC, settlement, which was already being dug over there for the last 15 years, called Tal Halamam, may have been the origin of the Sodom myth. Because when you dig into Tal Halamam, you get down a meter or two and you find a burn layer where everything was actually, completely destroyed. It's just north of the Dead Sea and has a lot of geographical clues that suggest it was Sodom. So we actually think that there were subsequent impacts to the Younger Dryas. It was certainly the largest and most devastating and globe changing. But then there were regional to, hemispheric events that happened subsequently. And you can see that in the tree ring record, right? That trees all over the earth stopped growing together, I believe, 5 times in the last 12,000 years. And the debate, that's well accepted. The debate is, was that caused by volcanoes or caused by potentially impacts? So we believe there was a tremendous impact 13,000 years ago, and the number of subsequent ones that haven't been accepted or acknowledged yet.
Mm-hmm. And the Noah flood, where do you believe that took place, if it truly took place?
Yeah, we've got a kind of a related team of researchers that's done more on that, and they believe the 8,000 year ago event, or 6,000 BC, where there's a well-defined climate crash then, could have been caused by an impact in the Indian Ocean. And not only would have that caused havoc in the nearby Middle East, but it would have lofted tremendous amounts of water into the atmosphere. And that helps explain how you could have, probably not exactly, but mythologically reported as having 40 days and 40 nights of rain.
Okay, what about Atlantis, which I've got pegged, according to Wikipedia, at 6,000 BC?
Yeah, well, a little bit. I don't know why they have 6,000, because what Plato told us, and that's the first reporter of Atlantis, he said 9,000 years before my own time. Okay, and that was, I believe, roughly 600 BC, 500 or 600 BC when he was around. Okay. So you add the numbers up, and that matches the end of the Younger Dryas. All right, so that's a hell of a coincidence. When you take forensic investigations like we've been doing that suggest, or we believe provide proof and evidence that there was an impact 12,000 years ago, and then you look at Plato with no such tools, reporting from oral tradition that at the same time, or he probably was describing the end of it, so it had been 1,200 years. There was a 1,200-year climate crash after the Younger Dryas event. That's what defines the Younger Dryas climate period, is 1,200 years of absolutely frigid global cold, and that is well accepted. It would have been 25 degrees cooler in the northern hemisphere for 1,200 long, miserable years. And then we pop out of it instantly, right? 11,600 years ago. And that time matches exactly when Plato said that that an island civilization became submerged. But in the writings and in our presentations and whatnot, we got enough to handle with the impact, right? And that's controversial enough. So we don't address directly what I call precursor civilizations, Atlantis and anybody that would have had high technology. Obviously, there were people around, the Clovis people, for instance, but were there people with greater understanding, sophistication, and higher culture? There very well may have been, but we don't address that in the papers because the evidence is scant, first of all. And you kind of got to stick to your knitting, which is a catastrophe. But the catastrophe being proven provides a lot of ammunition to the Atlantis believers, like Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock, right?
And the believers would say that this event caused the oceans to rise, and
that's
therefore cover up this continent or island. Right. And but then once we pull out of that period, why wouldn't it reemerge? Because you got a rising of the oceans and then a receding, I presume, at some point.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in making their arguments over Atlantis. But you have a tremendous rise of sea level, or actually when the Younger Dryas starts, you actually have a drop. You have an initial influx of water, then things freeze back up for 1,200 years. A lot of that water's locked back up. And then you have another meltwater pulse 1,200 years later when the seas rise. And I believe the precursor civilization community say that that's what submerged those lands. It also has a tie-in to Göbekli Tepe, if you come across that temple in Turkey. And that's the oldest acknowledged human temple gathering place, megalithic, large stone construction location on Earth. And we believe that that was actually or elements of our team believe that that was a time stamp where the people who had survived the catastrophe wanted to memorialize it for, future generations, many generations, and that they actually arranged that temple so that it would suggest the date that we've been talking about of 1280 before now. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And are we in any particular period now, according to you guys, as far as still feeling the effects prior impact?
Yeah, it's not nearly as great a threat. Okay. But it's a little bit like traffic, Jim, in that you have the Taurid meteor stream, which causes 2 meteor showers a year in late June, early July, and then in late October, early November. And we encounter that stream of disintegrating comet material, and we know it as the Taurid meteor shower. There's particularly a group of astronomers that for 40 or 50 years in Great Britain that have argued that that has been the source of multiple impacts through the ages. And that when we identified the Younger Dryas impact, that would have been the first very bad day that we had from the disintegration of the Taurid meteor comet, which you actually call Comet Encke. So you would have had we estimate a 60-mile wide comet come into the solar system about 20,000 years ago. Then it begins to disintegrate. Now it's all, down to little bits, we hope, most of it. And that earlier in its stages of disintegration, there was a lot more large material. So if you think about us passing into this meteor stream twice a year, it's a little bit it's like someone with a blindfold walking across a highway into traffic. If you think about it, most of the time, probably not in Southern California, but around here on smaller cities traffic, most of the time you can walk across the highway and you're probably going to make it across. There might be some near misses, right? But if you go hit it during rush hour, there are going to be a lot more cars you're going to hit, and there are also going to be some trucks in there. And that's what we believe happens when we have these larger periods of trauma, is you're hitting a particularly enhanced part of the Taurid meteor stream. But fortunately, that stuff is disintegrating, okay? And you're going to have less and less danger of it.
When was the last time you believe we were hit by anything of any size?
Well, we know the last time was in 1908 in Siberia, and that's very relevant. And that's called the Tunguska impact. And that leveled 1,000 square miles of tundra in Siberia. Absolutely leveled it, knocked down every tree, and also produced some of the same evidence that we find at the black mat, particularly in the microspherules, okay? And that when you encounter this kind of heat, it could be 3,000 degrees centigrade. And it also whips with the concussion of the explosion of the object. It lifts both the soil and the material on the earth today, mixes it with the material from the impactor, and it vaporizes both silicates and metallics parts of the soil. That turns into a vapor. That vapor freezes, if you will. It's molten for a moment and freezes in these little tiny bits. And that falls back and creates a layer. They found that at Tunguska. So that was in 1908, and that would wipe out a city now.
And how big an object was that?
I think they say it's like 150, 200 meters. So not terribly big, but you could see hundreds of those when you encounter particular parts of the Taurid meteor stream at particular times on those bad weekends when you're walking across, or rush hour when you're walking across that highway.
Right. So 150 meters wide, and that ended up impacting how large an area?
1,000 square kilometers.
Wow.
devastated it, knocked every single tree flat and incinerated them. Yeah.
The extinction, again, forgive me for relying on Wikipedia,
Sure.
but woolly mammoth.
Yeah.
They've gotten, I guess maybe there's multiple species of woolly mammoth, but
yeah,
according to that, the most commonly accepted is that it went extinct 2000 BC.
Yeah, that's right. Like I said, we're not saying that in an instant all of these animals disappeared, right? But it was so traumatic that no one disputes that the mammoth begins a severe decline and, in fact, regionally becomes extinct 12,000 years ago. But there were certainly holdouts around the world, and those, the last remaining mammoths, remember what I said about them taking larger things out, and it probably is related to that same phenomenon. But one way or another, the pygmy mammoths survived, smaller mammoths. So even during the times of the Egyptians, that time period you just pointed out, 2 or 3,000 BC, during the time of the construction of the pyramids, there were still mammoth remaining on Wrangel Island, north of Siberia in the Arctic Ocean. Right. Gotcha. So there were some holdouts. There were some refugia, they call it, where, there were some leftovers.
So, and is there anything in particular that caused their final extinction?
Probably human hunting of one sort or another, or just the natural decline of the population finally reached an endpoint. Mm-hmm. I don't think that they claim on Wrangel Island they did, but we believe that the humans that were left over might have helped accentuate the extinction that was already underway. Mm-hmm. Right. So the Clovis people or whatever the others that were left would have hunted the rest of them to extinction, possibly.
And I had the saber-toothed tiger at 8,000 BC. Extinction.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. But they were thriving before 12,000 years ago and go into severe decline about that time. I've got a saber-toothed tiger skull right there, actually.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And why would that species have gone extinct compared to others?
Yeah, you could have a loss of genetic diversity. You could have a change in their food source. You could have other climate down periods. We're losing species today now, and you could have had human hunting for the same reason that probably not of the saber tooth,
but again brought on originally by the Younger Dryas period.
That's right.
Reducing the population of them significantly to the point where they're becoming endangered.
That's right. And then through some combination of factors that is still to be determined, they eventually blinked out. Mm-hmm. But you need something, we can't explain everything in absolute detail for how this played out because there's simply enough research being done in it. And we'll probably spend many generations trying to puzzle it all out. But the key thing to know is that all of these processes were set in motion at the same time 12,000 years ago. And you find indications all over the Northern Hemisphere and parts of the Southern Hemisphere that was a dramatic time. And we don't accept that, right? We leave the mystery as a mystery. And that's why it's appropriate to be on the Hidden Truth show, because this is a truth that isn't accepted because of a long-standing scientific debate, that goes back to the 18th and 19th century between uniformitarians that believe all geological processes that we see operating today cause everything we see today, and catastrophists. And the catastrophists were obviously related to the faithful back in that time. They were going from the Bible and going from the deluge. And as more rational empirical science, came into being during that time, they properly rejected a lot of the biblical received wisdom, right? But then they totally rejected it. So if someone tells you that Sodom, which I just mentioned as being part of the research, or that the flood, et cetera, was caused by God, and then you are becoming an empirical, rational, evidence-based researcher, you're going to reject anything that is supposedly God-driven, right? So they rejected the catastrophist explanations, when actually, although it was embedded in the faith, they're very physical means for those things to happen. And they're actually physical evidence that those things did happen, but we're still suffering from having tossed away, kind of thrown out the baby with the bathwater, and thrown out biblical knowledge with its understanding of catastrophism. And we need to bring that back and mix it back in, just like we did with the dinosaurs, but understand that things happened more recently too.
Mm-hmm. And where do you stand on the issue of there perhaps ever having been even more intelligent life than humans today on Earth that were wiped out by a cosmic event?
Personally, I'm open-minded to it, and I believe Graham Hancock's onto something, but it's going to be very, very difficult to find the evidence, right? We could get to your show last week, but I'm a panspermist as well, and I wish panspermia had come up on the recent show I heard about the evolution of humans and how things jumped ahead. And I remember he was talking about the Cambrian explosion, et cetera.
Yeah. We'll touch on it real quickly because the headline from that was him making the point that he doesn't believe that evolution can explain the existence of humans. He doesn't think, based on his analysis or various scientists, that evolution moves quick enough to have developed humans on Earth.
Yeah, well, I probably don't need to dig a deeper hole with the skeptics, but on a personal basis, I'm involved, with another research group, Mr. Chandra Wickramasinghe, who worked with Sir Fred Hoyle, who was the preeminent scientist in Great Britain in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And Chandra and Sir Fred proposed in the early 70s that life on Earth isn't a closed system, and that we're receiving microbial input from space all the time that includes DNA, and that actually life is absolutely abundant, and comets, in fact, are boiling cauldrons of life and viruses. And they went out and looked at the spectra of galactic clouds that we would call, dust clouds out, in interstellar space. They looked at that spectra, and you know what that spectra matches, Jim? When you look at the light feature and the nature of the light that's coming from there, E. coli, exactly. Right? So they've got graphs that show what E. coli's light looks like. And they believe, and frankly, I believe as well, that microbial life in a desiccated, hibernated form, not talking about living things actually living now, floating out in space, unentombed, but entombed within cosmic dust, that those forms of life, including things that like diatoms and whatnot, and I'll give you some more evidence on that in a moment, could survive by being entombed in a piece of cosmic dust. Okay, and it wouldn't destroy their DNA and their life processes, and that's been proved. The tardigrade, little tiny thing called a water bear, which is found all over the Earth, they've taken those, NASA has, and exposed them to interstellar space, put them on the outside of the space station, and those little buggers survive. So what that suggests is if we had an impact into the Earth and it launched, including things, and these aren't even microbial, I mean, they're visible under, low power microscopes, and it launches that stuff out into space, a lot of that stuff would survive. So there's no reason to believe that over galactic timescales that there isn't vast transfers of that material, and that would include DNA, and that probably all forms of life we see on the Earth are reflected somewhere else, and that DNA and material is floating around. I'll give you an example. The Russians tested the outside of the space station, I believe it was 6 times between about 2013 and 2017, and actually swiped the window on the outside of the space station, or one of the windows, maybe it's the big one that you sometimes see them looking through, and then brought that material back to Earth, and it was filled with bacteria and diatoms. There was actually a scum of formerly living material on the outside of the space station. That's damn hard to explain. And the only way they were able to explain it without using the work of Fred and Chandra was that material had been lofted by some mechanism yet understood from the Earth into the orbit of the space station and had covered it then. So that suggests that if that can happen, why wouldn't it float further into space or move further out into the solar system or other solar systems and other parts of our galaxy to feed life in those places as well? So there would be a vast intergalactic and galactic transfer of genetic and life material that we don't acknowledge yet.
Mm-hmm. And then what about the issue of evolution? Because either way, whether we ultimately evolved from these microbes or whatever you call them that came from outer space, making all of us essentially aliens or alien life, but still you need enough time for that to evolve on Earth. Is it your view that there has been enough time for?
Yeah, I think it's assisted by panspermic processes. That there's no question evolution is in place, and I am not opposed to Darwinian evolution as generally understood. I just think it needs an amendment to accept the fact that evolution is a galactic phenomenon, and that the evolved pieces of that, it may evolve someplace more quickly or some places older, so it's had longer to evolve, but parts of those genes and those processes make it to other places and influence the evolution here. For instance, the octopus appears very, very suddenly in the geological or the animal record. It didn't have time to evolve. There's a wonderful piece written, well, there was a paper and then a great follow-up article, deep article in Cosmos explaining all of this. But our panspermic team actually believes that you could have been seeded with the octopus, and it could have grown here after it came in cosmic material. Now, I know that stuff's hard to believe, but remember, there's a lot of stuff floating around out there. We're talking about it earlier, and you think of it as lifeless. But no one has ever directly tested these propositions. But again, if you indirectly test them through spectra and whatnot, you can see indications that there's more life out there, or there is life out there that we don't acknowledge. You know, we haven't tested this. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, and the octopus would have arrived here in what form?
Probably as ova, you know, as that some portion of them, that only takes a few, right, could have come in and then rebirthed themselves, if you will. And I know this sounds like crazy stuff. I should give you a good citation so people could go dig back in, because it's frozen specialty.
A frozen octopus egg, essentially.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. But just think of the time scales you're dealing with. You know, we give ourselves, we say, well, my gosh, we've had, 800 million years or 400 million years, or when you were talking last week, you can go back and find life going back 2 billion years. We say we accept that must be enough time to evolve. Okay, why isn't it also easily accepted that if it shows a tremendous self-centeredness, Jim, to say that life began here? Okay, and it's interesting. People will sooner believe that aliens will enter people's bedrooms and probe them, right, than they will believe what I told you about microbial life being entombed in cosmic dust and floating around. They say that's crazy talk. But a significant percentage of those people believe that they're actually aliens, and maybe there are, driving little craft around and coming into people's bedrooms at night, right? I find that a hell of a lot harder to believe. Perhaps it's possible, but harder to believe that there might be microbial and other undeveloped, fully birthed, etc., life forms that are transferring out in the cosmos as a general matter.
Yeah.
And that's known as panspermia. It's easily looked up.
Thank you again to George Howard. Thank you to our producer, Michael Parker. Thank you all for listening. We'll be back soon with another episode of The Hidden Truth Show.
Thank you for listening to The Hidden Truth Show with Jim Breslow. You can find us at hiddentruthshow.com. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Truth Show. Join us again next week for another episode of Hidden Truth Show with Jim Breslow.